January 12th, 1888, 3 p.m. Outside, the world had ceased to exist. There was no sky, no ground, only a shrieking, horizontal vortex of white. The wind, a physical monster, slammed against the Wyoming prairie with the force of a locomotive, carrying ice pellets that scoured wood down to its grain. Inside the dugout, Silas Garrett called home. The only sound was the gentle hiss of the cast-iron stove and the soft rustle of a page turning. The air was a comfortable 55 degrees. A single oil lamp cast a warm golden glow on the packed earth walls and the thick timber beams overhead. Silas, a man of 42, with hands like cured leather and eyes the color of a winter sky, sat in his handmade chair, reading a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius. A few feet away, a sturdy connecting tunnel led to a smaller, equally snug dugout where his gray mare, Misty, crunched contentedly on a ration of oats, safe from a storm that was already killing horses by the dozen in their proud, drafty barns. The blizzard, which would later be known as the Schoolhouse blizzard, had descended without warning, but for Silas Garrett, it was not a surprise. It was an inevitability he had been preparing for since the first day he'd driven a spade into the earth. 9 months before the storm, in the hopeful green of April 1887, Silas Garrett had arrived in the burgeoning town of Summit, Wyoming. He was not a typical homesteader. He didn't speak of bumper crops or vast cattle herds. He spoke of windbreaks and thermal mass. A veteran of the Army Corps of Engineers, he'd spent 2 brutal winters surveying the Dakota Territory, where he had seen Mother Nature's casual cruelty firsthand. He'd seen men freeze solid 100 yards from their own front doors and watched entire herds of cattle perish, frozen upright in the snow. He presented his plan at the land office to Mayor Hutchkins, a man whose ambition for Summit was matched only by his preference for conventional thinking. A dugout? Hutchkins had scoffed, stroking his thick mustache. Mr. Garrett, we're building a modern town here, a town of the future, clapboard houses, 2-story facades, not gopher holes. Silas remained patient. He unrolled a crude schematic on the mayor's desk. Sir, a structure built into the south-facing side of a hill, with 3 feet of sod and earth overhead, will maintain a stable temperature year-round. It will be cool in the summer, and, more importantly, it will be defensible against the winter. The earth itself is insulation. The wind can blow 100 miles an hour over the top, and inside you'll barely hear it. I can build the entire thing, a main room and a connected stable for my horse, for under $200. Hutchkins squinted at the drawing. It looked primitive, almost savage. And a proper house, what does that cost? A proper house, as you call it, will cost you 10 times that in lumber alone, Silas said, and 10 times that again in firewood, just to keep it from freezing your bones come January. I'm not building for show, Mr. Mayor. I'm building to survive. The mayor, seeing the paltry sum Silas intended to spend, shrugged. It was his land, his money. If the man wanted to live in a hole in the ground, it was no concern of the town of Summit. He stamped the claim for a rocky, undesirable plot on a hill 2 miles out of town that no one else wanted. The total cost of the land was $50. The estimated cost of the home, $175. Word of Silas's project spread through Summit like a prairie fire. The ridicule began at the general store, the town's social hub. Montgomery Sterling, the wealthiest rancher in the county, held court by the Cracker Barrel. Sterling was a man who believed progress could be measured in board feet and panes of glass. He was in the process of erecting a magnificent two-story Victorian home with a sprawling porch and bay windows, a project costing him nearly $3,000. "Heard about the new fellow, Garrett?" Sterling boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "The Army engineer plans to live in a hole like a prairie dog." Laughter echoed through the store. Thomas Brennan, the builder Sterling had hired, chimed in. "A hole is right. A man could dig his own grave for a lot less than $200. What happens when the spring rains come? He'll drown in his own bed." The name stuck. From that day forward, Silas's home was known as Garrett's grave. The name was spoken with a mix of pity and contempt. Silas, who came to town only for essential supplies, heard the whispers. He saw the smirks. He ignored them. He had work to do. The construction began in May. It was a solitary, Herculean effort. Silas and his gray mare, Misty, were a team. He would plow and cut the thick prairie sod into heavy, brick-like rectangles. Misty, harnessed to a stone boat, a simple wooden sled, would drag the sod bricks and the heavy timbers he'd hauled from the nearest woodlot up the hillside. He first excavated the hillside, digging back 25 feet and carving out a space 30 feet wide. He was not merely digging a hole, he was engineering a dwelling. The floor was packed clay, hammered until it was as hard as stone. The walls were reinforced with thick cottonwood logs, and the roof was a masterpiece of frontier engineering. Heavy timber beams formed the main structure, layered with willow branches, a thick coating of prairie hay for insulation, and finally, the heavy sod bricks, laid grass side down to create a living, interlocking roof that would be held together by its own root system. He built a stone hearth and chimney at the back of the structure, its mass designed to absorb and radiate heat. He fashioned a single, large window on the south-facing front wall, angled to catch the low winter sun. Then, he dug the smaller connecting tunnel and excavated the stable, a smaller, cozier version of the main house. The entire project took him 3 months of back-breaking labor, from sunup to sundown. The final cost, including the stove, a single glass window pane, and nails, came to $182. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Whether you're in the mountains, the plains, or somewhere the wind howls just as fierce, these lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the crisis finally arrives. As the summer sun beat down, the mockery intensified. Montgomery Sterling's grand house rose plank by proud plank, a monument to prosperity. The townsfolk would ride out on Sundays to watch Silas toil, shaking their heads in amusement. A betting pool was started in the saloon on how long Garrett's grave would last. Most bets were on the first heavy snow collapsing the roof. A new slang term entered the local lexicon. When a man was engaged in what was seen as a foolishly complicated or stubborn task, people would say he was pulling a Garrett. It meant ignoring common sense, wasting time on a lost cause, essentially digging one's own grave through sheer obstinacy. Even the new school teacher, a kind young woman named Miss Harriet Thornton, was gently warned by the mayor's wife to keep her distance from the town eccentric. "He's a strange one," Mrs. Hutchins had said. "Best not to get involved." Silas heard it all. He felt the isolation, a wall built of whispers and laughter. But he had his work, his horse, and his certainty. He'd seen the blizzards. He knew what was coming. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. By late September, the dugout was complete. The first signs of its superiority were subtle. As a heat wave baked the valley in the final days of summer, Sterling's new house was an oven. Silas's home, insulated by the cool earth, remained a pleasant 65 degrees. When the first autumn frost arrived in October, the reverse was true. While others frantically fed their stoves against the encroaching chill, the thermal mass of the earth surrounding Silas's home held the day's warmth long into the night. A small fire in the evening was enough to keep the space comfortable until morning. The town, however, remained unimpressed. "A cool cellar in the summer proves nothing," Sterling declared. "Wait until real winter comes. We'll see who's comfortable then, in my parlor with its German stove, or him in his dirt coffin." Silas simply went about his business, stocking his larder, cutting and stacking firewood, and enjoying the quiet solitude of his unconventional home. He felt no anger, only a quiet, grim patience. The first week of January, 1888, was unnervingly mild. A warm Chinook wind blew from the mountains, melting the scant snow cover and turning the frozen ground to mud. The town of Summit celebrated the thaw. It felt like an early spring. Silas Garrett felt no such comfort. He saw the warning signs the land offered to those who knew how to read them. He saw the strange greenish tint in the western sky at sunset. He noticed the prairie birds, usually scarce in winter, flocking in unusual numbers to the sparse cover of the creek bed. He watched the cattle in the fields bunching together, restless and agitated. On the morning of January 11th, he made his final preparations. He hauled extra buckets of water from his well, filling a large barrel inside the dugout. He chopped enough kindling to last a week and stacked it by the stove. He moved 4 extra bales of hay into Misty's stable through the connecting tunnel, ensuring he wouldn't have to venture outside for any reason. He checked the seal on his door and the single pane of his window. When he made a trip to the general store for coffee and salt, he tried to warn old Samuel, the proprietor. "There's a bad one coming, Samuel," he said quietly. "This warmth is a liar. I've seen it before." Old Samuel just chuckled. "Silas, you've been saying that since you got here. Enjoy the sunshine. Might be the last we see for a while, but it ain't the end of the world." Silas bought his goods and left. He had done what he could. January 12th dawned bright and deceptively pleasant. Children walked to the one-room schoolhouse in light coats. Ranchers rode out to check on their herds without heavy gear. At around 11 a.m., the change began. A dark, boiling wall of cloud appeared on the northwestern horizon, a phenomenon the old-timers called a blue norther. The wind died, creating an eerie, absolute silence. Then the front hit. It was not a storm. It was an atmospheric explosion. The temperature, which had been a mild 34 degrees Fahrenheit, plummeted. Within an hour, it was below zero. By mid-afternoon, it was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind that gusted to over 60 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that was simply unsurvivable. The snow didn't fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, scouring blizzard that reduced visibility to zero. The schoolhouse blizzard had struck, catching the entire territory by surprise. In Summit, chaos reigned. At Montgomery Sterling's grand Victorian home, the pride of the county, the north-facing bay windows shattered inward, blasted by the wind. Snow and ice flooded the parlor, extinguishing the expensive German stove. The wind tore shingles from the roof, and the entire structure groaned as if it were being torn apart. Sterling and his family huddled in the kitchen, frantically stuffing blankets into the broken windows, their pride turning to terror. All over town, the story was the same. Conventional, above-ground houses proved to be little more than wooden traps. Chimneys blocked with snow, filling rooms with smoke. Doors froze shut. Roofs began to sag under the impossible weight of the accumulating drifts. People were freezing in their own homes, their firewood supplies suddenly, terrifyingly inadequate against the unprecedented cold. The greatest tragedy was at the schoolhouse. Miss Thornton, seeing the storm's ferocity, had kept the children inside, but the poorly built structure was failing. The wind found every crack, and the single stove was no match for the Arctic blast. They were trapped. 2 miles away, in Garrett's grave, Silas stoked his fire. The wind howled over the roof of the dugout, but inside it was a distant, muted roar, like a faraway waterfall. The temperature remained steady. He cooked a simple meal of bacon and beans, the smell filling the warm, secure space. He could feel the deep, abiding safety of the earth around him. He was not fighting the storm. He was sheltered within its indifferent heart. Near dusk on the first day, there was a brief, almost imperceptible lull in the wind's fury. It was then that Silas heard a frantic pounding on his thick wooden door. He unbarred it to find a figure encrusted in ice, barely recognizable as a man. It was Thomas Brennan, the builder. His face was a mask of frostbite, his clothes frozen stiff. "Garrett, for God's sake," he stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "My roof, the chimney's blocked. We're freezing." Silas said nothing. He simply pulled the man inside, sat him by the stove, and wrapped him in a heavy wool blanket. An hour later, more figures appeared, ghosts materializing out of the white maelstrom. It was Miss Thornton, the school teacher, with 5 of her older students. They had made a desperate run from the failing schoolhouse, following a fence line they knew led toward Silas's hill. The teacher was crying, her face raw from the wind. 2 of the children were already showing signs of severe frostbite. Silas took them all in. He tended to their frozen hands and feet, administered hot coffee, and gave them his own bed, huddling closer to the stove himself. His dugout, once a subject of ridicule, had become an ark. If this story has touched you, subscribe to Wild West Retribution. We bring you tales of frontier wisdom and vindication every week. Now back to the story. Over the next 36 hours, more survivors staggered to his door, guided by the faint, steady column of smoke from his well-designed chimney. Mayor Hutchkins and his wife, old Samuel from the store, 2 entire families whose roofs had collapsed. Silas welcomed them all without a word of reproach or a hint of, "I told you so." Garrett's grave was now a crowded, bustling sanctuary. 23 people, 15 adults and 8 children, were packed into the single room. Silas took command, his old army training surfacing. He organized watches for the fire. He rationed his stores of food and water, ensuring the children were fed first. The space was cramped and smelled of wet wool and fear, but it was warm and it was safe. They listened to the blizzard rage outside, a monster they could hear but not feel. And in the lamplight, they looked at the quiet, capable man they had mocked. They saw not an eccentric, but a prophet. The storm finally broke on the morning of the 3rd day. The wind died, and a brilliant, merciless sun rose over a world transformed. It was a landscape of alien beauty and profound horror. Snowdrifts, 20 feet high, buried barns and houses. The town of Summit was gone, erased beneath a blanket of white. When the survivors emerged from the dugout, blinking in the intense light, the scale of the devastation became clear. Montgomery Sterling's Grand Victorian was a shattered wreck. Its north wall collapsed entirely. The schoolhouse roof had caved in. Dozens of barns were crushed, their livestock lost. The final toll for Summit was 17 dead, including 5 children who never made it home from school. Across the territory, hundreds had perished. In the silence of the frozen aftermath, the only fully intact, fully functional dwelling in or around the town of Summit was the one they had called Garrett's Grave. 4 days later, the surviving townsfolk gathered in the shell of the ruined church. It was a somber, broken assembly. Montgomery Sterling, his face bandaged from frostbite and his spirit shattered, stood before them. His voice, usually so full of bluster and pride, was a raw whisper. "I was blind," he began, looking directly at Silas Garrett. "You were the only one who could see. I called your home a grave. It became our ark. We built our homes with pride, and the wind took them. You built yours with wisdom, and it sheltered us. I spent $3,000 on a monument to my own vanity. It's kindling now. You spent less than $200 on a home that saved 23 lives." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the huddled, grieving families. "I have been a fool. We have all been fools. We thought we knew better than the land itself. We were wrong." He turned back to Silas, his arrogance replaced by a desperate humility. "Will you teach us? Will you teach us how to build like you?" The entire assembly turned to Silas. In that moment of profound reckoning, he felt no triumph, only a deep sorrow for their loss. He stood and looked at the faces before him. The mayor, the builder, the rancher, the teacher. "The past is frozen under the snow," Silas said, his voice calm and steady. "Let's build a better future." Montgomery Sterling was true to his word. He used what was left of his fortune not to rebuild his own mansion, but to fund the reconstruction of Summit. Under Silas Garrett's direction, a new town rose from the ruins. But this time, there were no proud 2-story facades. They built as Silas taught them. They used the land itself, digging into the south-facing slopes of the rolling hills. They learned to cut sod, to lay timber for strength, to respect the awesome power of the Wyoming winter. The slang term "pulling a Garrett" was still used, but its meaning had been completely inverted. Now, it meant applying uncommon foresight to a problem. It meant preparing for what others refused to see. It meant having the courage to be right when the whole world called you a fool. The Garrett method of construction became the standard not just for Summit, but for the surrounding counties. Silas Garrett never sought wealth or power. He lived out his life in the original Dugout, a respected elder and a living legend. He never married, but he became a grandfather to the generations of children who grew up in the warm, safe homes he had taught their parents to build. They would visit him, bringing him fresh bread and listening to his quiet stories. He died peacefully in his sleep in 1927, at the age of 82. The entire town and people from 3 counties turned out for his funeral. They buried him on the hill, overlooking the town he had saved. The legacy of Silas Garrett was not written on a bronze plaque. It was written into the very landscape of the Wyoming prairie. In 1891, the territorial government in Cheyenne sent a team of engineers to Summit to study his designs. They documented his methods of insulation, ventilation, and structural integrity. The resulting publication, a simple pamphlet titled "The Garrett Dugout, A Guide to Sensible Frontier Construction," was distributed to every new homesteader in the territory for the next 20 years. His knowledge, born of experience and dismissed as folly, became the official wisdom of a generation. His gray mare, Misty, who had helped him build his ark, lived to a ripe old age and was buried beside him on that quiet hill. His quiet foresight saved not just one town on one terrible day, but countless unknown families in the decades that followed. Pride builds for sunny days. Wisdom builds for storms.